In Florence, during the late years of the Renaissance, a city celebrated for its art and gilded chapels, there arose a quieter obsession whispered only in corridors of power, the birth of children who bore no mark of their beginning. Infants emerged without the small scar of the umbilical cord, their bellies smooth, unblemished, as if they had been carved directly from stone. The midwives gasped, the mothers wept in awe, and the fathers saw in it the hand of God himself. To a city steeped in superstition, this was not a deformity but a divine signature. Rumors spread that such children were touched by angels, destined for greatness, carriers of a hidden purity that separated them from the rest of humankind. But behind this miracle was a man who watched and measured with a colder eye. Dr. Lorenzo Bardi, a physician born into nobility yet trained in the damp chambers of anatomy schools, recognized not holiness but opportunity. He recorded each birth with clinical obsession, tracking which families bore the unscarred and which carried the shame of ordinary flesh. Outwardly, he was a healer, a quiet servant of Florence, baptizing newborns with gentle hands and whispering reassurances to mothers. Inwardly, he was already calculating how far the human body could be bent, altered, and perfected through suffering. Bardi's fascination was not random. His studies in Paracelsian texts and old treatises on purity convinced him that the belly was the seat of spiritual inheritance, and that the absence of the umbilical scar marked a child free from earthly corruption. He began to believe that the body could be purified of its mortal stains through calculated interventions, that perfection was not given by heaven but forged in the crucible of deliberate pain. To him, the unscarred infants were proof of possibility, a glimpse into a future he could manufacture. He needed more of them, and he knew the city would never willingly provide. So he watched, waited, and quietly experimented. The hospital wards gave him access to the forgotten poor, infants born to mothers who would never question a physician's word. When a baby died, he demanded its body for dissection, claiming it was for the advancement of knowledge. No one objected. Who would argue with progress in a city that worshipped its thinkers and artists? But his knives moved not to learn but to test. He carved across the belly, removing the cord tissue in ways that left no scar, forcing new closures of the skin with alchemical salves. He watched as some infants withered from infection while others healed in silence. A few terrifyingly lived, bearing bellies smooth as marble, indistinguishable from the miraculous births whispered in noble homes. The first time he succeeded, he cradled the infant as if it were his own creation, smiling at the sight of its body unmarred. He whispered that the child was no longer bound to the filth of mankind, but to a higher design. Yet the mother, a servant, woman, noticed the strange swelling of her child's abdomen and begged for help. Bardi assured her that it was natural and prescribed a tonic, knowing full well the child would die within days. The mother's grief was drowned in poverty, and no one questioned the physician who served Florence's elite. In time, Bardi's secret work spread in whispers, not as horror, but as marvel. Noble families who heard of him began to seek his blessing, asking that he attend their births, praying that their heirs might be born scarless. Bardi encouraged their faith, feeding them selective truths, always hinting that purity was possible but never revealing the grotesque lengths he pursued to achieve it. His reputation blossomed as that of a quiet miracle worker, yet his hands were stained with the blood of infants whose cries had been smothered in his chambers. The paradox of his evil was its silence. There were no screams in the streets, no public executions, no signs of outrage. Instead, there were rumors of divine children and the subtle growth of reverence for the physician who seemed always present when miracles occurred. The city celebrated him as pious, yet behind the mask of innocence he had already embraced a theology of flesh, one that demanded torment as its scripture. His obsession was not only with birth but with rebirth, transforming the body through ritual suffering until it shed the visible proof of humanity's filth. What Florence did not yet see was how this obsession would swell beyond infants, how the same techniques would be inflicted upon adults in hidden chambers, how the quest for purity would become an industry of pain. For now the city believed in blessings. For now the physician's smile calmed mothers and reassured fathers, and for now only Bardi himself knew that the smooth bellies of these children were not signs of heaven, but of a darker God he was quietly constructing in the silence of his mind. The births without scars were the beginning. They would become the foundation of a doctrine that would demand blood in quantities the city could not imagine. The people celebrated angels, but in truth, they had welcomed a predator dressed in the robes of a healer. Evil was already among them, patient, calculating, hidden beneath the cries of newborns that would not live long enough to tell what had been done to them. And in the shadows of Florence, Bardi sharpened his knives, preparing not just to observe miracles, but to manufacture them, one body at a time. By day, Dr. Lorenzo Bardi walked the polished halls of Florence as a man of dignity, consulted by noblemen and abbots, respected by midwives and servants alike. He healed fevers with herbal remedies, soothed the aches of aristocratic ladies, and whispered prayers over the weak. His posture was calm, his words soft, his face free of arrogance. To most, he was the image of a devoted physician. Yet when the doors of his practice closed and the patients left, a different face emerged, one that regarded flesh as material, bones as puzzles, and blood as a language waiting to be decoded. Bardi's chambers were not those of an ordinary doctor. Beneath his house, hidden by a staircase disguised as a grain store, lay the true heart of his work. Here the walls were lined not with religious icons, but with jars filled with pale organs suspended in alchemical solutions. Human eyes floated like pearls, livers sank in cloudy tinctures, bones were filed into careful rows. The air was sour with rot masked by incense. His instruments, knives of varied edges, clamps designed not to heal but to hold, thin metal rods for probing wounds, were polished and arranged with the precision of a sacred altar. For him they were relics of devotion, each blade a psalm, each jarred specimen a verse. The experiments began with the smallest, for children were easiest to disappear. The poor who left infants at the hospital doors believed the city's physicians would offer mercy. Mercy was indeed offered, but in Bardi's vocabulary it meant surrendering flesh to the cause of his theology. He began by cutting away skin in geometric patches, squares, and circles carved into the abdomens of infants and orphans, patterns measured as though on parchment. He observed how the body attempted to heal itself, noting how the skin pulled, tore, or sealed. He forced regrowth through the application of salves mixed with ground silver, mercury, and vinegar, substances that seared and scarred, often killing his subjects slowly. Those who lived became living diagrams, crawling testaments to his cruelty. But simple cutting was not enough. He grew fascinated by the nerves, by how they carried pain, by how they betrayed the human form with their silent transmission of suffering. He learned to locate them with precision, stretching the bodies of young boys on wooden frames, slicing into their thighs and arms until the pale threads of nerves were exposed. He would then pluck them with fine iron hooks, listening to the body's involuntary spasms as though they were music. He called this his violin, a grim metaphor only he could admire. He measured how long a body could endure such torment before it collapsed into death, and he recorded it all in ink upon parchment bound in flayed skin. To Bardi, this was not sadism but study. He convinced himself that agony was the purest form of truth, for only in agony did the body reveal its deepest secrets. Pain stripped away lies, leaving only the core mechanics of flesh and spirit. He believed he was peeling back the layers of humanity to reach a hidden order, and in this delusion, every scream was confirmation, every death a revelation. His notebooks grew heavier, filled with sketches of children's bellies sewn shut without scars, diagrams of sinew stretched until breaking, charts of how blood spilled differently when cut with copper versus silver. The more he saw, the less human his subjects became. As months turned into years, Bardi's ambitions expanded beyond children. He began taking in paupers who came to him for cures, offering food, warm blankets, and promises of healing. Once their trust was secured, they were quietly shifted to his underground chambers where their illnesses became irrelevant. Their bodies became canvases. Some were bled slowly over weeks through hidden incisions, forced to survive on measured rations so that he could observe the changes in their flesh. Others were bound in silence and subjected to suffocations, their chests compressed with weighted boards until their lungs collapsed in controlled stages. He marveled at how long the human body resisted surrender, how the will to live could be twisted and prolonged under his orchestration. The deaths were not clean. They were staggered, layered, often designed to extend awareness until the very end. He found a particular fascination in keeping victims conscious while dismantling them, forcing them to confront their own unraveling. He whispered to them during their final moments, telling them they were not dying but being reborn, that their pain was necessary for the unveiling of purity. He framed his cruelty as ritual, cloaking murder in the language of theology and science, so that even he could pretend he was serving a higher order. Florence above remained oblivious. The cries that echoed through the catacombs were muffled by stone, mistaken by servants as the creaking of pipes or the howls of wind. Those who wondered why some poor never returned from his care assumed disease had claimed them. Nobles, dazzled by his reputation, continued to invite him to oversee their births, never suspecting that his hands bore the memory of countless deaths. Yet Bardi himself was changing. The more he studied, the colder his heart grew. His smile became practiced, his compassion rehearsed. He carried death in his eyes, though few ever looked long enough to notice. Inside, he felt not guilt but power, an intoxicating control over life's boundaries. He believed he had stepped into the role of creator, shaping flesh according to his design, deciding who would suffer and who would be spared. He was no longer only a physician, he was becoming a priest of agony, a conductor of rituals written in blood. And still, this was only the beginning. The city's trust gave him access to bodies in endless supply, and his notebooks were filled with plans for what would come next, transformation that would extend beyond hidden infants and nameless paupers, ambitions that would pull nobles themselves into his theology of suffering. He sharpened his knives, rehearsed his procedures, and waited for the moment when Florence itself would bow before the chapel of pain he was quietly constructing beneath its streets. Beneath the cobbled streets of Florence, where torchlight faltered and damp stone walls pressed close, Lorenzo Bardi carved out a sanctuary that no church would bless. The catacombs under Santa Croce, long abandoned by monks who feared collapse, became his cathedral. He transformed its silence into an altar for his work, its shadows into choir stalls for the voiceless dead. This was no place of prayer. It was a place where bodies became scripture, where skin replaced parchment, where agony was the hymn. He named it not aloud, but in his mind, the Chapel of Skin. Here, Bardi's victims did not simply die, they were displayed, immortalized, rewritten. He had grown frustrated with simple dissection and torture. Death alone was fleeting, too quick to contain the weight of his beliefs. He sought permanence, a way to inscribe his theology into the very architecture of Florence. He began by stripping the flesh from his subjects in long, unbroken sheets, using knives honed until they could separate skin from muscle without tearing. The hides were stretched and dried, then fastened against stone walls with iron nails, forming pale banners that glistened in the dim candlelight. Upon these surfaces he traced words in his own blood, passages that mingled science, scripture, and madness. He claimed these writings were revelations, that suffering had spoken through him. The chapel grew wall by wall. Children's skin framed the arches, their delicate textures turned into ghostly murals. The bodies of paupers were flayed and transformed into faceless icons, their flesh overlapping like mosaics. Novices from nearby convents who had vanished without explanation reappeared here in fragments, their torsos stretched across ceilings, their hands arranged like relics clutching candles. Bardi believed he was not desecrating but consecrating, preserving their essence in a purity greater than life. He convinced himself that every nail driven into flesh was a benediction, every scream a hymn sung to an unseen god of order. His ritual was precise. Victims were chosen not at random, but according to his twisted taxonomy. He divided humanity into two kinds: the pure, represented by the scarless-born, and the impure, represented by the rest. The pure, he believed, could only be sustained through sacrifice. Thus the poor, the abandoned, the shamed were his offerings. He rationalized that their agony purchased the continuity of Florence's noble lines. In this logic, nobles became gods and the poor became currency. With each death, the Chapel of Skin became both ledger and altar, a silent record of transactions between cruelty and ambition. To those rare few who glimpsed it, the sight was unbearable. One servant sent to deliver supplies stumbled into the chamber and beheld walls dripping with stretched human hides, the faint outlines of faces still visible in their flattened forms. She screamed and fled into the streets, but within hours she was found hanging beneath the Ponte Vecchio. her body bruised in ways that suggested she had not leapt willingly. Barty spread the tale that madness had claimed her, and Florence believed him, never realizing that her final vision had been the truest mirror of the city's hidden sickness. The chapel was not only a tomb, but a stage. Nobles who whispered about scarless heirs were sometimes invited to see his work, led down torchlit staircases and shown the murals as though they were paintings. Barty spoke to them of purity and sacrifice, his voice calm, almost tender, while the nobles gazed in horrified awe. Many pretended revulsion, but none withdrew their patronage. Some even left offerings, coins pressed into his hand, securing their family's access to his supposed miracles. Their complicity fed his ambition. Their silence ensured his immunity. In their hunger for purity, they became his accomplices. One of Barty's most perverse creations was the altar itself. He fashioned it from the rib cages of men and women, fused together with pitch and bound by iron clamps. The ribs arched upward like Gothic stonework, framing a surface draped in a single unbroken sheet of skin peeled from a dying monk. Upon it he performed his rituals, vivisections carried out as though they were sacraments, the bodies trembling upon the altar as he murmured prayers twisted from Latin hymns. Blood flowed down the ribcage channels, pooling into bowls that he preserved, believing the liquid carried fragments of divinity stolen in death. In this chapel, time lost meaning. Barty would remain for hours, whispering to the hides as if they were congregants, asking them questions about pain and purity. He claimed they answered him in silence, their stretched forms vibrating with unseen truths. The more he listened, the more convinced he became that he was chosen, that God, or something darker, had appointed him to lead humanity into a higher order through the language of suffering. His madness was not chaos, it was method, structure, ritual. Evil lived not in rage, but in devotion. Above, Florence glittered with art and commerce, its streets alive with music and masquerades. Below, the chapel of skin expanded, fed by the bodies no one missed, adorned with murals no one dared to acknowledge. The two worlds coexisted, one built on beauty, the other on horror, both dependent on silence. No bells tolled for the vanished. No records marked their absence. In the eyes of the city, they had never existed. And Barty, alone in his subterranean cathedral, smiled as he touched the cold, preserved faces upon the walls. He did not see the victims. He saw disciples. He saw scripture. He saw proof that suffering could be eternal, that purity could be engineered, that flesh itself could become the foundation of a new faith. In the chapel of skin, his theology had found its temple, and Florence, without knowing, had become his congregation. In the upper halls of Florence, while musicians played in candlelit salons and nobles drank from silver cups, a quieter fascination stirred beneath the layers of silk and ritual. The whispers of scarless children had already gripped the city, but now came darker rumors. Rumors of a physician who did not only witness miracles but manufactured them. Dr. Lorenzo Barty's name drifted through noble circles like incense, soft, intoxicating, impossible to ignore. To the rich, he was not a man of medicine, but a gatekeeper of purity. And for a city obsessed with lineage, purity was priceless. At first, the nobles came discreetly, cloaked and veiled, slipping into Barty's chambers at night to beg for his counsel. They offered gold, jewels, estates, anything that might guarantee their heirs would be touched by his hidden gift. Barty received them with humility, feigning reluctance as though his knowledge was a burden. Yet behind his lowered eyes and gentle hands he savored their desperation. He began to understand that his cruelty could extend beyond the poor and the abandoned. Now the most powerful men in Florence were willing to purchase agony itself. To bind them to him, Barty offered more than promises. He invited them into the hidden depths beneath Santa Croce, where the chapel of skin breathed its silent sermons. With torches casting long shadows over walls of flayed flesh, he revealed his theology to those who thought themselves untouchable. At first the nobles recoiled. Some covered their mouths, others crossed themselves, but none turned away. Their horror was tempered by awe, their revulsion by a secret thrill. For these were men and women accustomed to theater, to pageantry, to performances of beauty and death. What Barty offered was theater stripped bare, truth carved into bodies with no mask of pretense. It began with demonstrations. He would bring forth a pauper or servant captured from the streets, bound within a contraption of iron shaped like a womb. The victim's body was curled into the cage until joints cracked and breath came in shallow gasps. Then slowly, Barty tightened the mechanism, compressing the figure until flesh folded inward. The nobles watched as the body shrank into a grotesque parody of an unborn child, lips trembling in muffled prayers, eyes bulging with terror. When at last the cage was opened, the corpse resembled the scarless born. Smooth, collapsed, emptied of the marks of ordinary life. The audience, pale and trembling, applauded as though they had witnessed art. Such spectacles became regular, whispered about in palaces, arranged like clandestine masquerades. Nobles attended in secret, each swearing never to speak of what they had seen. They brought their wives, their sons, their mistresses, dressed not in velvet, but in masks that covered their shame. They sat in rows before Barty's altar of rib cages, their jeweled hands clasped as though in prayer, while bodies screamed and broke before them. Some claimed they attended only to protect their families, others confessed in whispers that they felt exhilaration they had never known. None left unchanged. Barty refined his performances for them. He suffocated women beneath folds of velvet until their lungs collapsed, creating corpses that appeared serene, untouched by violence. He drowned infants in basins of warmed milk, declaring that their final breaths had been cradled by purity itself. Monks captured from convents were inverted and fed mercury until their skin blistered and their tongues swelled. Each method was tailored for symbolism, each death presented as a ritual of cleansing. Barty explained them with calm precision, speaking of purity, rebirth, and sacrifice, while his patrons listened as though at a sermon. The nobles did not merely watch. They paid. They paid in gold, in favors, in silence. Their wealth built the chapel of skin into a labyrinth of death, expanding its halls with marble and iron, adorning it like a church of suffering. Some even contributed victims, offering up servants, debtors, or rivals under the guise of mercy. They assured themselves that they were witnesses to medicine, to theology, to truths too dangerous for the common people to see. In truth, they had become accomplices to murder, bound by the secrecy of shared sin. Florence above thrived with art and commerce, its reputation polished by painters and sculptors who immortalized beauty. But beneath, beauty was being remade into horror, and the city's most powerful citizens knew it. They did not speak of it at banquets, but when their eyes met across gilded halls, they knew. They shared a secret that was darker than any affair, any treachery. They had stood in the chapel of skin. They had applauded death. For Bardi, this patronage was more than protection. It was validation. Their presence proved to him that his theology was irresistible, that even those who claimed refinement were seduced by his rituals. He grew bolder, more elaborate, weaving symbolism into each killing. The chapel became his stage, the nobles his audience, the victims his unwilling actors. And Florence unknowingly became a city sustained not only by art and commerce but by cruelty, a place where purity was purchased with screams buried in stone. What began as whispered miracles of scarless children had now become an industry of suffering, financed by the very hands that signed Florence's laws and shaped its future. And as the nobles returned to their palaces draped in velvet and crowned in jewels, they carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed. Not miracles, not science, but the revelation that evil, when draped in ritual, could be applauded as progress. The chapel of skin had already become a theater of dread, but Lorenzo Bardi knew that death, to capture the imagination of nobles, needed refinement. Raw brutality was too crude, too obvious. He understood that cruelty must be disguised as beauty, wrapped in symbols the elite could not resist. Thus he began crafting methods that appeared gentle, elegant, even tender, but whose outcomes were more devastating than any blade or fire. Among these, his most infamous creation was the velvet suffocation. Velvet was a fabric revered by Florence's wealthy, soft, luxurious, kissed by light in ways that made it appear alive. Nobles wore it to announce their power. Priests draped altars with it to signal holiness. To Bardi, velvet was more than fabric. It was deception, a skin that promised comfort while hiding suffocation. He designed deaths that clothed horror in luxury so that the nobles watching might mistake agony for grace. The first demonstration was staged before a gathering of cloaked patrons in the chapel. A young woman, her body trembling but her face masked with resignation, was lowered onto a stone slab. Bardi wrapped her slowly in sheets of violet velvet, layer upon layer, until her figure resembled a swaddled icon. He pressed the fabric gently to her mouth and nose, explaining to his audience that velvet absorbed air, that the softness which caressed their skin could also deny breath. As the woman's chest strained and faltered beneath the folds, her eyes filled with a glassy panic. The suffocation was not sudden but slow, her lungs collapsing as if cradled into silence. When at last she stilled, her face bore no bruises, no marks of violence, only a mask of peace. The nobles gasped, not in horror but in admiration. She looked as if she had fallen asleep in luxury, as if velvet had delivered her to heaven. The method spread among his rituals, each execution more elaborate. He experimented with colors, crimson velvet that turned pale skin into an image of martyrdom, black velvet that gave death the dignity of mourning, gold velvet that made corpses glow under torchlight. Some victims were wrapped entirely, their bodies bound so tightly that ribs cracked beneath the weight. Others were buried alive in coffers lined with velvet, their final hours spent in darkness scented with perfume, their screams muffled until silence claimed them. Each variation became a sermon, a performance not of violence but of purity disguised as elegance. The nobles were enthralled, They whispered that no death could be more dignified than velvet suffocation, that it erased the ugliness of mortality. Some began requesting it for their own kin, illegitimate children, shamed relatives, widows whose presence threatened estates. They justified it as mercy, convincing themselves that to die in velvet was to die in beauty. Their requests filled Barty's chamber with an endless supply of victims, each delivered with the hush of secrecy, each wrapped in fabric that once adorned Florence's most sacred spaces. But velvet was only one of his inventions. Barty devised deaths that mimicked rituals of innocence. Infants were drowned in warmed milk, their tiny bodies slipping beneath the white surface while noble patrons prayed over them, believing their souls were returned to a primal purity. The wealthy were told this was not murder but baptism, a cleansing from the filth of humanity. Monks captured from isolated convents were inverted, suspended by their ankles and fed mercury through silver funnels. Their insides blistered, their prayers turned to guttural shrieks, their tongues swollen until silence returned. To Barty, this was not cruelty but a correction, a way to reorder bodies that had been corrupted by sin. Each method was chosen for its symbolism: milk for innocence, mercury for transmutation, velvet for beauty. He told his patrons that death was not an end, but a transformation, a passage from impurity into scarless purity. They clung to his words, eager to believe that their sins could be washed clean through ritual suffering inflicted upon others. In their eyes, Barty was not a murderer but a priest, conducting ceremonies on their behalf. Yet behind his calm voice and measured gestures, Barty felt something more dangerous than devotion. He felt mastery. The chapel no longer frightened him, it exhilarated him. Each body was an instrument, each scream a note, each death a revelation. He believed he had surpassed both church and science, that he had discovered a law deeper than Scripture, that suffering itself was divine. When he wrapped velvet around a trembling victim, he did not see agony. He saw a prayer answered. He saw himself as both sculptor and God. Outside, Florence continued its masquerades. Families celebrated marriages, painters unveiled masterpieces, merchants counted coins. But beneath the city's stones, velvet suffocations and milk drownings and mercury feasts continued, hidden rituals financed by the very hands that commissioned art and cathedrals. Evil had taken its seat not on the margins but at the center of power, disguised as beauty, sanctified by silence. The chapel of skin had grown into a cathedral of ritual, its walls echoing not with hymns but with the soft struggles of suffocating breath. Nobles left its chambers shaken yet enthralled, carrying with them memories that blurred into dreams. They returned again and again, unable to admit to themselves why. And Barty, the quiet physician who bowed politely in daylight, returned to his knives and his velvet in darkness, certain that he had discovered not only how to kill but how to sanctify death itself. At first, Florence hardly noticed the disappearances. A servant girl gone missing, a pauper child no longer seen begging at the markets, an elderly monk who failed to appear at vespers. Such losses were explained away as theft, hunger, or wandering. But as months slipped into years, the silences began to multiply. Families buried empty coffins, mothers whispered of children stolen by angels, and bells tolled for deaths that had no bodies. The city wrapped its grief in superstition, convincing itself that the vanishings were not the work of men but of heaven's hidden design. Lorenzo Bardi fed this delusion with calculated precision. Each victim was recorded not as a disappearance but as an illness, a fever, a wasting disease. He filed death notes, fabricated symptoms, and signed them with his careful hand. To nobles, he whispered of miracles of purity preserved. To the poor, he spoke of plagues, of illnesses too swift to fight. His calm explanation soothed suspicion, even as his chapel beneath Santa Croce filled with the remnants of countless bodies. The truth, however, could not remain entirely hidden. Servants whispered of wagons seen at night, hauling sacks that dripped faint trails of blood. Merchants muttered about missing apprentices who had last been sent to deliver goods to the physician's house. Midwives grumbled that too many infants placed in Bardi's care never survived. Yet Florence was a city accustomed to secrets. Its streets hummed with conspiracies, its palaces hid betrayals, its churches veiled sins. In such an atmosphere, Bardi's work was easy to bury. Rumors became little more than smoke swallowed by the city's appetite for silence. Still, the scale of loss began to weigh upon the people. In poorer districts, entire families seemed to vanish within months, their homes left abandoned, their names erased from parish rolls. Some claimed it was pestilence, a hidden plague creeping through alleys. Others insisted witches had cursed the city. The church, desperate to maintain control, declared the vanishing divine punishment for Florence's sins. Bells rang nightly, prayers echoed in darkened chapels, but none addressed the true cause. A physician whose knives carved bodies into scripture. The psychological toll spread like infection. Mothers grew fearful of childbirth, believing their infants might be born unblessed, marked for disappearance. Fathers drank themselves into stupors, unable to protect their families from an unseen predator. Children learned to walk in silence, avoiding streets where wagons rolled at dusk. The poor no longer trusted hospitals, fearing that once admitted they would never return. Even among the wealthy unease grew, though none dared accuse the man they had themselves financed. Florence was suffocating not with sickness but with dread. Bardi observed this hidden epidemic with clinical fascination. He measured its spread not in corpses but in fear. He noticed how easily families accepted loss when given a language of plague and punishment. He saw how quickly they turned against one another, blaming midwives, cursing neighbors, burning suspected witches in the square. Their desperation was his shield. The more they searched for curses, the less they saw the physician in their midst. To him, this was proof of his superiority. He had discovered how to kill not only bodies, but truth itself. His chapel echoed with this triumph. Each victim added another mural, another fragment of his theology. He began creating patterns, arranging skins and bones to mimic constellations, believing he was mapping the heavens through human suffering. He whispered that Florence itself was becoming his congregation, its terror a hymn, its silence a prayer. In his eyes, the epidemic was not tragedy but progress, a necessary purge that lifted the city closer to purity. But cracks began to show. In the convents, nuns recorded the sudden loss of novices who had gone to deliver alms. In the guilds, masters demanded answers for vanished apprentices. Priests grew uneasy with the sheer number of funerals performed without bodies. Whispers gathered momentum. Perhaps it was not plague. Perhaps it was not God's punishment, but something far worse. Yet each time suspicion stirred, it dissolved against the wall of Bardi's reputation. He was the physician who served Florence's elite, the man who blessed scarless children. To accuse him was unthinkable. Still, Florence itself was changing. The air grew heavy with mourning. Streets seemed emptier, bells tolled longer. Markets closed earlier, families barred their doors at night. An invisible weight pressed on the city as if the stone walls themselves carried the memory of the vanished. Those who survived began to live like the dead, their joy muted, their eyes hollowed. The epidemic was not of the body but of the spirit, and through it all Barty thrived. His hands never shook, his voice never faltered. He moved through Florence with the serenity of a man who believed himself chosen. While beneath the streets, his chapel grew into a labyrinth of suffering. Every disappearance, every empty coffin, every silent funeral was a stone laid upon his hidden altar. The epidemic was his masterpiece, an entire city grieving what it could not name, blind to the predator who walked among them. Above, Florence mourned. Below, in the chapel of skin, Barty whispered to the preserved faces of his victims, thanking them for their sacrifice, promising that their agony had not been in vain. For in his theology, suffering was not death. It was the foundation of a new purity, a faith carved from silence and sealed in blood. By the mid-years of his reign of silence, Lorenzo Barty no longer contented himself with private dissections or velvet suffocations. His appetite demanded spectacle, ritual that fused theology, anatomy, and theater into a single act. For him, death was no longer enough. It had to become a ceremony. And so he conceived what he called the anatomical wedding, a grotesque union of flesh and symbol, staged deep within the chapel of skin, with Florence's nobility seated as honored witnesses. Invitations were whispered, never written, passed from one trembling hand to another among the city's elite. Those who arrived descended into the candlelit chamber draped in velvet, their masks hiding fear as much as identity. They found before them a stage not of wood but of bone, an altar crafted from fused rib cages that arched like Gothic vaulting. Upon it lay two bodies, an aristocratic youth who had vanished weeks prior, and a pauper woman taken from the streets. Both had been drained of blood, their skin treated until it shone like wax. Their limbs were arranged as though in repose, but their empty eyes stared into nothing. Barty began with a sermon. He spoke softly of purity and corruption, of the need to bridge the divide between noble and base, pure and impure. His words floated through the chamber like incense, mesmerizing his audience. Then, with precise movements, he opened both bodies from throat to pelvis, his knives slicing as calmly as if cutting fruit. Gasps echoed from the cloaked nobles, yet none dared to leave. They had already surrendered themselves to his theater. The marriage commenced as organs were removed, washed in bowls of perfumed water and exchanged between the two corpses. The heart of the pauper was stitched into the noble's chest, while the noble's lungs were forced into the pauper's cavity. Kidneys were swapped like dowries, intestines wound together like garlands. Each exchange was narrated by Barty as though part of a wedding ritual. Vows of blood, gifts of flesh, unions sealed not with rings but with sinew and thread. His hands moved with surgical grace, his eyes alight with devotion. The nobles watched in a trance. Some turned pale, others trembled, but none withdrew. They told themselves they were witnessing science, progress, and revelation. They told themselves they would remember it as a sermon rather than a slaughter. Yet within their hearts they knew they were complicit, bound by the secrecy of what they had chosen to see. When the organs had been rearranged, Barty stitched the bodies together side by side, their arms entwined with iron wire. Their faces were pressed close, mouths sewn into a grotesque kiss. He wrapped their torsos in linen soaked with resin, binding them until they became a single figure. Two bodies fused into one, grotesque yet strangely dignified. He declared them husband and wife, pure and impure, united in eternity. Then the altar was set alight, flames licking the resin until the fused corpse crackled and smoked. The air filled with the stench of burning flesh, and Barty commanded his patrons to inhale deeply, declaring the smoke an elixir, a communion of purity. Many gagged, but all obeyed. Cloaked nobles lifted their heads, breathing in the thick air as though it were incense. Their eyes watered, their throats burned, but in that act they were forever marked. They had consumed the essence of Barty's theology, inhaled the ashes of victims sacrificed in the name of purity. The wedding was complete not in the altar, but in their lungs, their very bodies becoming part of his ritual. The anatomical wedding became legend within the chapel. It was whispered of with awe, even among those who despised themselves for attending. Some nobles claimed to have seen visions in the smoke, angels weeping, infants laughing, flames reshaping their sins into scarless purity. Others collapsed afterward, trembling with nausea and fear, yet they returned for the next ceremony, unable to resist the pull of Barty's sermons. What they had witnessed was not merely cruelty, it was transformation, the illusion that evil could sanctify itself through ritual. For Barty, the anatomical wedding was proof of his ascension. He had taken corpses, reshaped them, and delivered their essence into the lungs of Florence's most powerful citizens. He had made them participants in his theology, binding them not only by secrecy but by communion. They could never turn against him, for his doctrine now lived inside their flesh. Above the city, marriages were celebrated with feasts and music. Brides and grooms paraded through streets in silks and garlands. Below, in the chapel of skin, another kind of marriage was forged, one of agony and silence, binding noble to pauper, purity to corruption, victim to witness. It was a union not of love, but of cruelty, sanctified by fire, remembered in smoke. And as the last embers dimmed, Barty stood before his trembling patrons, his hands blackened with soot, his eyes gleaming with conviction. He did not see corpses, nor nobles, nor himself. He saw a congregation bound together by suffering, a church built not of stone but of bodies. The anatomical wedding was no performance, it was a covenant. And Florence, whether it knew it or not, had just exchanged its vows. Amid Florence's silence, amid the nobles' secret worship of cruelty, there remained one woman whose eyes did not turn away. Sister Magdalena of the Santa Verdiana convent was not known for defiance. She was quiet, obedient, a scribe who copied scripture in the dim light of the cloister. Yet her work brought her near the hospitals where Dr. Lorenzo Barty practiced, and her task of cataloging parish records often meant handling his certificates of death. She began to notice their patterns, infants recorded with illnesses that left no marks, apprentices declared dead though their families insisted they had only vanished, not perished. Where others saw tragedy, she saw repetition. And repetition to a mind trained in transcription meant design. Her suspicion sharpened when she discovered the discarded remnants of a book binding delivered to the convent for reuse. It was unusual, not of calfskin or goat, but of something thinner, paler. When her hand touched it, she recoiled. It was human. Beneath the waxy surface, she recognized faint pores, the outline of a nipple. The leather had once been flesh. Horrified, she traced the source back to a box marked with Barty's seal, left anonymously as a donation. It was not charity, it was evidence. Driven by a sense of duty, Magdalena began to investigate further. She lingered near the hospital wards, asking quiet questions of the midwives. She spoke with beggars who whispered of wagons at night. She compared death records against parish rolls and found names vanishing without graves. Her notes grew into a secret ledger of absence. Children, novices, paupers, apprentices, all erased with Barty's hand as witness. She felt the weight of truth pressing against her silence, demanding to be spoken. At last, she summoned the courage to confront authority. She carried her findings to the Archbishop's palace, trembling as she begged an audience. In a dim chamber, she laid her parchment before him, pointing to the patterns, the names, the falsified deaths. She whispered of bindings made from flesh, of chambers rumored beneath Santa Croce, of noble patrons complicit in horrors. Her voice shook, but her conviction was firm. Florence was being consumed by a hidden plague, not of nature, but of man. The Archbishop listened in stony silence, his face unreadable. When she finished, he closed the book of her notes with deliberate care. He did not rebuke her. He did not bless her. He merely dismissed her with a promise that the Church would consider the matter. Yet as she turned to leave, she saw it. The faint tightening of his jaw, the glance exchanged between clerics at his side. They were not shocked. They were complicit. That night, Sister Magdalena was seized in her cell. No trial, no explanation, only rough hands and gagged silence. She was dragged through the convent's crypts, past the bones of long-dead nuns, until she reached a narrow chamber half built into the wall. There masons waited with mortar and stone. Her pleas were muffled by cloth, her prayers swallowed by fear as she was forced inside the cavity. The wall closed upon her inch by inch, sealing her into darkness. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, each thud echoing against the stone. She screamed until her throat bled, clawed until her nails split, begged until her breath failed. For days, faint knocks and whimpers seeped through the crypt, heard only by novices too frightened to speak. Then at last, silence. Her body remained entombed, unseen, her discovery buried with her. But the ledger she had kept did not die. Some pages had been hidden among her scripture, preserved by chance. A novice who stumbled upon them years later would recognize the handwriting and shudder at the implications. Yet in her own time, Magdalena's warning went unheard. Her voice was smothered not by disbelief but by design. The Church, bound to the nobles, chose silence over truth. The loss of Sister Magdalena became a whispered ghost story within the convent. Some said they could still hear her scratching at the walls. Others claimed her spirit lingered in the corridors, eyes wide with accusation. But the deeper truth was more chilling. Her fate revealed that Florence itself was complicit, that every institution, from noble palaces to holy altars, was bound to Barty's work. Evil did not thrive because no one saw it. It thrived because those who did chose silence. Barty himself knew of her death. The archbishop informed him in a quiet exchange, assuring him that the scribe's words had been contained. Barty smiled, not out of relief but satisfaction. He understood then that his power was not merely in knives or rituals, but in silence itself. He did not need to hide if every institution would hide him. The chapel of skin could grow unchecked, because the voices that might accuse him were already sealed in stone. Above, Florence rang its bells as usual, praying for deliverance from sins it did not name. Below, the chapel of skin expanded, walls lined with the faces of the vanished. And in the crypt of Santa Verdiana, Sister Magdalena lay in suffocating darkness, her discovery entombed within her lungs, her silence added to the chorus of the city's unspoken dread. It was water that betrayed him. For years, the chapel of skin had survived in silence, hidden beneath the weight of Florence's stone. But in the spring rains of 1567, the Arno swelled, flooding streets, collapsing walls, and seeping into the catacombs. The flood carried not only mud and debris, but the memory of everything buried beneath the city. In the chaos, Lorenzo Barty's sanctuary began to unravel. The first sign came when children playing near Santa Croce noticed a foul stench rising from a fissure in the earth. They told their mothers that the stones were bleeding, that a river of rot flowed beneath the church. Soon after, masons sent to inspect the cracked foundations broke through a wall and recoiled at what they found. Behind it stretched a chamber of horrors, human skins stretched like parchment, faces distorted in permanent screams, bones wired together in grotesque architecture. The water had loosened the nails, peeling the hides from the stone. The murals that had once gleamed with Barty's devotion now sagged, dripping, collapsing under the weight of decay. Word spread quickly. Citizens poured into the catacombs with torches, priests trailing behind with trembling hands. What they saw was not a chapel, but a mausoleum of cruelty. Murals of children's flesh hung like spoiled tapestries, organs preserved in jars floated in the murky flood, and skeletal remains jutted from the walls where stone had crumbled away. The altar of rib cages had collapsed, spilling charred fragments of fused corpses across the floor. The air was thick with the stench of centuries of hidden agony released all at once by the flood. Men gagged, women fainted, and priests fell to their knees, crossing themselves in horror. The names of the vanished were suddenly given faces. Mothers recognized the shape of a child's hand nailed into a mural. Fathers collapsed before bones that bore familiar rings. Novices whispered prayers over the stitched remains of their sisters. The truth could no longer be hidden. Florence's epidemic had not been plague or punishment. It had been one man's theology, financed by the very nobility who now trembled in the torchlight. Barty himself was nowhere to be found. Servants claimed he had fled during the storm, carrying only a bundle of books bound in pale leather. Some swore they saw him riding toward the hills, his cloak soaked, his face calm as ever. Others whispered he had vanished into the flood, swallowed by the river as payment for his sins. But his absence mattered little. His legacy was written on every wall of the chapel, every torn face, every silent corpse. The city could no longer deny him. Panic erupted in Florence. Families demanded to know which nobles had patronized Barty's rituals. Servants whispered of velvet suffocations witnessed by cloaked masters. Midwives confessed suspicions they had long buried. The archbishop preached of sin and purification, yet his trembling voice betrayed his own complicity. The people realized that their grief had been orchestrated, their losses purchased, their silence traded for the illusions of purity. Trust collapsed alongside the chapel. The psychological toll was immense. Mothers clawed at the walls of Santa Croce, screaming the names of their missing children. Fathers carried torches through the ruins, swearing vengeance against nobles they could not touch. Priests walked the streets with ashes on their foreheads, begging God for forgiveness for sins they had buried in stone. Florence became a city of mourning, not for plague victims, but for the betrayed, the forgotten, the unburied dead who had been turned into scripture by a physician's hand. The nobles, terrified of exposure, moved quickly to erase their footprints. Records were burned, witnesses silenced, accusations redirected toward heretics and witches. They told the people that Bardi had been a madman, acting alone, unblessed by church or crown. They pretended ignorance, feigned disgust, and commissioned sermons denouncing him as a beast outside the order of humanity. But the people knew better. They had seen nobles descend into the chapel at night. They had heard whispers of velvet-wrapped deaths and milk-drowned infants. Their silence was no longer ignorance, it was complicity. Bardi's chapel, exposed to the flood, could not be sealed again. The walls continued to crumble, spilling relics into the streets. Children found bones along the riverbank. Merchants uncovered jars of preserved flesh in the mud, and dogs carried limbs through the markets. Florence itself had become contaminated by his theology, unable to rid itself of the stench. The chapel of skin, once hidden, now existed everywhere, in memory and rumor, in every crack of stone that leaked its horrors into daylight. And yet, despite the fury, despite the cries for justice, Bardi's absence left a wound that could not be closed. No trial was held, no execution staged, no catharsis delivered. He had escaped judgment, leaving Florence to drown in the weight of his sins. His victims remained nameless in official records, their suffering erased even as their bodies were displayed. The city attempted to move on, to bury the memories with holy rites. But the collapse of the chapel had already carved itself into Florence's soul. Evil had not ended with Bardi's disappearance. It had simply revealed itself, torn open by floodwaters, staining every noble who had applauded, every priest who had silenced, every citizen who had chosen not to see. The chapel of skin was gone, but its echoes would never leave the city. Florence did not recover quickly. After the flood exposed the chapel of skin, the city became a place of mourning, a place where silence weighed heavier than bells. The walls of Santa Croce were scrubbed, the chambers sealed, the remnants buried in mass graves, but the stench of centuries of cruelty clung to the streets. Citizens walked with their eyes lowered, avoiding questions they did not dare ask aloud. Every corner seemed haunted, every alleyway filled with shadows that looked like the faces of the vanished. The city's beauty remained, but it was poisoned, its marble facades hiding a memory no one could erase. Authorities moved swiftly, not to deliver justice, but to control the story. Bardi was declared a madman, a rogue physician who had deceived even the noblest families. His name was scrubbed from records, his writings ordered burned, his image cast as something monstrous, less than human. The nobles who had once financed his work denounced him with trembling voices, pretending to be victims of his deception. Yet the people who had seen them descend into his chambers knew the truth. They understood that Florence itself had been complicit, that the city had applauded cruelty disguised as ceremony. Still, laws were written in the aftermath. Secret dissections were outlawed, hospitals placed under tighter watch, convents ordered to account for every novice, every child left in their care. Midwives were given new powers to report suspicious deaths, and priests were instructed to record every burial with greater scrutiny. These measures were meant to calm the public, to suggest that the city had learned that it would not allow another chapel of skin to rise. Yet beneath these reforms lay fear. Not compassion, not justice, but fear of exposure. A memorial was raised near Santa Croce, a stone marker for the unburied dead. It bore no names, for most were never recorded, but families came anyway, pressing flowers into the cracks, whispering prayers for children who had vanished into silence. Mothers touched the stone as if it might still carry warmth from the bodies it represented. Fathers stood in silence with tears hidden beneath cloaks. The memorial became a place of pilgrimage, not for tourists or art, but for grief, a wound that the city could not cauterize. Yet Bardi's influence did not vanish with his chapel. Across Europe, whispers of his methods traveled among physicians and scholars. His journals, though ordered burned, were preserved in fragments by those too curious or too devoted to destroy them. Centuries later, anatomists cited his diagrams of nerves, his studies of skin and healing, even as they pretended ignorance of their origins. His cruelty became a foundation for progress, hidden behind the language of science. The world condemned him, yet quietly borrowed from him, unwilling to admit how much of modern knowledge had been built upon the cries of his victims. For the nobles, the legacy was one of shame. Generations later, families would erase records of ancestors who had attended his rituals, rewriting lineages to distance themselves from the chapel of skin. Palaces that had once echoed with laughter became haunted by silence, their wealth tied forever to suffering they pretended had never occurred. Some commissioned new chapels, new artworks, as penance, as distraction, as attempts to wash away the blood that clung to their names. But memory lingered, and whispers never faded. Florence became a city where beauty and horror were bound together, each masterpiece shadowed by the cruelty that financed it. For the people, the legacy was simpler and heavier. They learned that evil does not roar in the open, but works in silence, behind closed doors, beneath trusted names. They learned that institutions meant to protect them, the church, the nobility, the physicians, could become accomplices when silence was easier than truth. And they learned that grief, when buried, festers, shaping a city's soul long after bodies have turned to dust. Philosophers would later write that Bardi's story was not about madness, but about complicity. A man alone could kill, but a city had to allow it for his work to grow into theology. Evil had survived not because it was invisible, but because those who saw it chose to look away. Sister Magdalena had tried to speak and was entombed for it. Others whispered but never shouted. And so the chapel of skin had thrived in silence until nature itself tore it open. Even centuries later, visitors to Florence who lingered near Santa Croce swore they felt it. The weight in the air, the sense of unseen eyes, the smell of damp stone that seemed tinged with something older. Guides avoided the subject. Records blurred it, but those who listened closely could still hear faint echoes in the walls, whispers of suffering that had never been given names. The chapel of skin was gone, but the silence it represented remained, an eternal scar hidden beneath the city's perfection. And so the question lingers, carried across generations, whispered in the spaces between history and myth. How many more chapels lie buried beneath the stones of our cities? How many doctors, priests, nobles, or leaders have clothed cruelty in beauty, convinced us to applaud rituals of suffering as progress? How often has evil operated not in violence, but in silence? The scarless children of Florence were not miracles, they were warnings. Warnings that purity is often purchased with blood, that institutions can sanctify cruelty, that evil thrives when we choose not to see. And now, centuries later, the story returns to us. The chapel of skin may be gone, but its legacy asks a question that cannot be ignored. What do you think? Could this happen again? Hidden beneath the institutions we trust, wrapped in silence, waiting for the flood to expose it?